What this article speaks about is what a situation that was to be found right next to these banlieues, right next to the suburbs, right next to these towers in the green, which was one of these big supermarkets, or as the French call them, hypermarchés. And in this case, it's actually a photo of an American one taken by Andreas Górski, which I already referred to a few seconds ago. These hypermarchés, the super large supermarkets, are usually placed right off the highway, and in this case, very close to this suburb. And that was not to everybody's content. The people in the suburb didn't like the extra traffic that they got through it, and much of it was vented through the riots on the cars or stealing off the cars. And what Zus is doing in this drawing here, on the right, you see the suburb area with the high towers, and on the left you see that hypermarché. But they're interested in a zone that's taking place in between these two situations. Two colossal situations, but what was happening in between that, and what was that article writing about? Strangely enough, and I don't know how this works, but the mayor of this town became the manager of the supermarket, which seems an interesting career move to me, but I'm sure it's all possible. And he realized when he started that job that people were frustrated. And having been mayor, he knew the possibilities of social programs. He started hiring people out of the towers, which was new for that supermarket. And the second thing he did is he gave them the possibility, after doing some research with them and finding out that they were very frustrated by not being able to find the food that they really wanted to have in those supermarkets, to sell their own stuff in the supermarket. Or basically in the zone in between the supermarket and the residential area, which created a whole new situation, which was much more pleasant, which was upbeat, and suddenly a zone that was by the French government called Zone Urbaine Sensible, which means a sensitive urban zone, which you can explain positively and negatively, but it was definitely a negative phrase in that case. Was turning around, and things were happening there. From a space that was an in-between space that was nothing, it became a hypersensitive and a hyper-productive space in between these two situations. Zus is calling this situation going from the hypermarché and the banlieue to the hyperlieu, which I find an interesting way of phrasing it. Good. To stay in this same time period, and actually we're at the end of the 90s, 1998 and 1999, I want to look at a few free states. And I'm intentionally using examples by artists and not by designers or architects, as I think you probably hear a lot about design and architecture today. The first example, and the slide may be a little bit washed out, it's actually fine, is an example of Joep van Lieshout, a Dutch artist who in 1998 was invited to do a project in Almere. Almere is a city in the center of Holland. If you have never been there, go, because there's a lot of interesting architecture, but as an urban space, it's quite complicated. And what he proposed was to start running a free state with its own money, its own legislation, and so on. Of course, this was not something that was approved by the local government, but it's referred back to some of his older work. Many of it is mobile spaces, mobile homes, and he did execute it later on, and I find that inspiring because it's really a space that's a weightless space in many ways in the port of Rotterdam. The top image is actually not at the port of Rotterdam because I've never seen a hill like that in the situation where I come from, but the images at the bottom are. And this is a place where he did start his own law system, he did start his own money, and of course there was a lot of criticism on it. The second example of these free states started in the same year. This is Thailand, the other side of the world, and this is Rikrit Tirvanitja, a Thai artist, actually dividing his time between New York, Berlin, and Thailand. And he started a project called The Land. And what he is doing, he's inviting people from abroad to build these lovely buildings that are on the site. But the most important thing is that it's a zone without property. Nobody owns here anything. It's all owned by the community. And everybody can use everything. And it's very much about ecology and discussion. And some really wonderful projects here. I find the interesting thing here is that he creates a situation between innovation and tradition on the other end. Then the last proposal of these free states is yet again on the other side of the world. And in this case, it's the desert in California close to Joshua Tree, where artist Andrea Zuttel in 1999, so 1 year later, started a project on her pots that she was working with, inviting friends to customize the pots and creating a small community around it. Interesting thing is that all of these, as you probably noticed, are taking place outside of the cities, are not part of the urban landscape, but are really part of a rural, natural landscape. And I thought that was kind of interesting, and I wondered why. And I think this may be the reason. We stay in California for a moment. This is Orange County on the coast, which is an area of endless sprawl. And this is an example of the last few months where one of the council women, and her name is Deborah Pauly, and she's not on this photo, this is not a lady that is screaming, was attending a protest event against a Muslim fundraiser. It was a very friendly fundraiser. There was not much to protest against, I would say. But she used this very strange quote, referring to that she knew enough Marines to help many of the people in that fundraiser to eternity as soon as possible. Of course, this resulted, and rightfully so, in a very, very long discussion because it's a scary thing taking place in cities, and perhaps that's why these artists escaped for a few years. Same thing is happening in other places around the world, and this is just one of the examples that I could give at the moment. Geert Wilders, probably many of the Europeans here recognize him, a politician from the Netherlands that started gearing up in his career at the end of the 90s, exactly at the moment when these artists were leaving the cities and starting their free states. He's a right-wing politician, known for his rhetoric that is going back to the 50s, and trying to move forward at the same time. So it's a very strange situation that people like he and also Deborah Pauly are creating. This book refers to his writing as being a 50s language. He very much speaks about getting lost, Holland getting lost, the Netherlands getting lost, not knowing where it's going to, and losing that old situation. I think many of the artists that I just showed you would find getting lost a very interesting situation. I also hope that many of the people here find getting lost interesting, because that's the moments when you learn, when you run into new situations. And probably one of the best references for this is Rebecca Solnit's book, A Field Guide to Getting Lost, where she writes beautifully about the challenges of getting lost, but also what is so exciting about it. And it's very much about creating a distance. So again, about what is happening between two situations and what happens if you're in between those two. This brings us to from the late 90s to now. And where you see a shift happening is artists that were initially leaving the cities, going to these natural environments, are starting to leave the city in a different way, but stay in the city in many respects, go to a digital situation. These are two architects from Belgium called Speedism, and this is their critique or their celebration, however you want to see it, on notions of getting lost in the ever-expanding cities in Asia. And it's very much about chaos, and where these politicians are looking about controlling situations, artists like Speedism are looking for a situation that's chaotic, and almost a doom scenario, but they're celebrating it. Second image from them. And the last image before I go into a different section is Qiao Fei, a Chinese artist who started this program, which I would encourage you to look at. It's called R&B City. It's a city in Second Life. So both she and Speedism are taking the city out of the normal city and taking it into to a 3D world that is digital. It's interesting to see this happen, and I wonder if you combine these two things, or three things. On the one side, the artists leaving the city at the end of the 90s. On the second level, the politicians that are looking for these extremes continuously. And on the third side, these artists, current artists, that are moving into this digital world. What can you do with that? This is a nice one because it's referring to the Guggenheim. You may have recognized a few of the other buildings. For instance, the yellowish building is the bank in Hong Kong that she's playing with. You see the Bird's Nest Stadium in the center.